April 20, 1861, Arlington House, Virginia. Colonel Robert E. Lee stood at his bedroom window, watching dawn break over the Potomac River. Across that river lay Washington, the capital he'd sworn to defend, the government he'd served for 32 years, the nation his own family had helped build. On his desk lay 2 letters. One was an offer from President Abraham Lincoln to command the entire Union Army, the highest military honor any American soldier could receive. The other was his resignation from the United States Army, written in his precise hand, but not yet signed. Virginia had voted to secede 3 days earlier. His choice was now brutally simple: lead the Union's forces against his home state, or abandon his oath and join the rebellion. Lee had spent 2 sleepless nights wrestling with this decision. He paced the floor, reading scripture, praying for guidance that never came. His wife Mary watched him with quiet concern. She knew what tormented him. For all his composure, for all the discipline that had earned him the nickname Marble Man at West Point, Robert E. Lee was being torn apart. At dawn, he made his choice. He picked up his pen, signed the resignation letter, and sealed his fate. Within 4 years, that decision would cost 750,000 American lives and destroy the world he'd known. Within 9 years, he'd be dead, his name forever linked to a cause that collapsed in blood and ashes. But how had it come to this? How does the son of a Revolutionary War hero become the general who nearly destroys the nation his father helped create? The answer begins 54 years earlier, in the fading glory of a Virginia plantation that had already seen better days. Robert Edward Lee entered the world on January 19, 1807, at Stratford Hall, Virginia, a grand plantation that belonged to his family in name only. His father, Henry Light Horse Harry Lee III, had once been one of America's great heroes. He charged into battle alongside George Washington, earned fame as a cavalry commander, served as governor of Virginia, and spoken at Washington's funeral with the immortal phrase, "First in war," first in peace and first in the hearts of his countrymen. But by the time Robert was born, Light Horse Harry had fallen far. Bad land deals, worse investments, and mounting debts had destroyed the family fortune. When Robert was just 1 year old, the Stratford plantation was seized and given to Henry's son from his first marriage. The lost revenue was merely the latest in a cascade of financial disasters that would eventually land Henry Lee in debtor's prison, twice. Robert's mother, Anne Hill Carter, had married into what she thought was Virginia aristocracy. Instead, she found herself trapped with a charming failure who couldn't provide for his family. She'd been born a Carter, 5th-generation plantation owners of the legendary Shirley Plantation, and expected the life of a Southern lady. What she got was poverty, public humiliation, and an absent husband. Henry Lee's final act of abandonment came when Robert was only 11. While defending a friend who opposed the War of 1812, Henry was beaten by a mob and severely injured. He left Virginia to recover in the Caribbean, promising to return. He never did. On March 25, 1818, Henry Lee died on Cumberland Island, Georgia, still trying to make his way home. Robert never saw his father again. The man who'd written George Washington's eulogy would be remembered in his own family, simply as the man who wrote Washington a bad check. Anne Lee was left to raise 6 children on a tiny inheritance from her Carter relatives. They lived at Ravensworth Plantation on the outskirts of Alexandria, a charitable arrangement with Anne's cousin William Fitzhugh. The house sat in the swampy, mosquito-infested part of town. Its interior remained unpainted. The Lees shared space with boarders to make ends meet. This was Robert's childhood, faded grandeur, genteel poverty, and the weight of a famous surname without the fortune to support it. Yet Robert retained warm memories from those lean years. He kept a pet lobster and hummingbird, beginning a lifelong love of animals though both died on the same day, teaching him young about loss. He spent summers swimming in the Potomac and playing in local springs. He attended a plantation school in Fauquier County before enrolling at Alexandria Academy at 14, where he proved himself exceptional at mathematics, literature, and the classics. More importantly, Robert took on responsibilities far beyond his years. When his mother's health began failing, he became her primary caretaker, managing her medications, helping her move around the house, organizing household affairs. Friends remembered him as a devoted son who sacrificed his own youth to care for an ailing parent. The experience shaped him profoundly. While other boys his age learned careless freedom, Robert learned duty. While they played, he worked. While they pursued their own desires, he put others first. This early training in self-denial and obligation would define every major decision of his life, including the one that would make him famous and infamous forever. West Point, forging the marble. Despite the family's financial ruin, the Lee name still carried weight in Virginia. When Robert turned 18, family friend William Fitzhugh wrote directly to Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, requesting an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Fitzhugh had young Robert personally deliver the letter to Calhoun in Washington, a calculated move that let Calhoun see the impressive young man in person. It worked. In 1825, Robert E. Lee enrolled at West Point. He was entering a different world. Virginia ran on slavery. The Lees themselves still owned 4 slaves left to Anne by her father. But as Robert traveled north to West Point, the number of enslaved people dwindled with each mile. In New York, slavery was nearly extinct. Free blacks walked the streets with liberties that would have been unthinkable in Virginia. For a young man raised in the South's rigid racial hierarchy, it must have been jarring. West Point in 1825 was undergoing transformation. Superintendent Sylvanus Thayer had recently cleaned up what had been a chaotic, drunken mess of an institution. He'd introduced the now famous cadet uniform, grey coats, starched white trousers, plumed black leather hats with polished brass chin straps. He'd imposed iron discipline. He'd elevated the curriculum to emphasize engineering and mathematics, skills crucial for modern military officers. When Lee arrived in June 1825, roughly 200 cadets faced an entrance exam designed to weed out idiots and misfits. Those who passed were assigned to tents with 3 other cadets. Each group had to purchase shared supplies: a toilet, mirror, washstand, basin, pitcher, tin pail, broom, and scrubbing brush. The food was notoriously poor, though Lee never complained. Wealthier cadets would sneak off to Gridley's Tavern to eat, drink, and smoke, an offense that earned demerits for most who tried it. Lee never went. In his entire time at West Point, he accumulated 0 demerits, a feat almost no other cadet achieved. The curriculum was brutally focused. Mathematics and French dominated the schedule. Mathematics was considered essential for military engineering and artillery calculations. French was necessary because France was America's only real ally, and most military textbooks were in French. The Marquis de Lafayette himself would occasionally visit West Point to inspect cadets, a living connection to the Revolutionary War that had made Lee's father famous. These visits inspired young Robert. Lafayette and his father had fought together. Now Robert was learning the same profession, studying tactics that would be obsolete within his lifetime. The daily routine was exhausting. Reveille at 5:30 a.m., full days of mathematics and French classes, hours of independent study, full dress drills, parades, and inspections. Lights out at 10 p.m., yet Lee thrived. He made friends easily despite his reserved nature. One early friend was a troublemaking third-year cadet named Jefferson Davis, who'd been caught sneaking off to the tavern to get drunk. Davis was only allowed to remain because of his previous good standing. The two would meet again, under very different circumstances. Lee also became close to Joseph E. Johnston, Albert Sidney Johnston, and Leonidas Polk, friendships forged in the discipline of West Point that would be tested decades later on Civil War battlefields. By the end of his first year, Lee ranked third in his class with a score of 285.14 out of 300 possible points. He was placed on the list of distinguished cadets, unusual recognition for someone so new. His reputation for emotional control under pressure earned him the nickname Marble Man. Win or lose, his expression never changed. During his second year, the curriculum added drawing. Officers needed to sketch usable battlefield maps. Lee was promoted to senior cadet and began tutoring fellow students in mathematics. He became fascinated by Napoleon Bonaparte, reading everything available about his campaigns. West Point's library was exceptional, and Lee's fluency in French gave him access to untranslated texts that other cadets couldn't read. Napoleon's tactics would influence Lee for the rest of his life. Like Napoleon, Lee would refuse defensive fighting. Like Napoleon, he'd favor rapid attacks and bold flanking maneuvers. Like Napoleon, he'd believe that audacity could overcome numerical disadvantage. And like Napoleon, he'd eventually discover that audacity has limits. After his second year, Lee maintained second place in his class. He applied for leave to visit his mother in Georgetown, where she was living with Lee's oldest brother, Charles. Anne's health had deteriorated severely. When Robert arrived home, he immediately took charge of her care, nursing her, managing her medications, organizing the household. He returned to West Point in 1827 for his third year. The curriculum added physics, chemistry, battalion tactics, and artillery use. Lee enhanced his knowledge by reading Machiavelli, Hamilton, Rousseau, and naval theorist John Paul Jones. His wide command of subjects beyond pure military science set him apart from other cadets, though he remained in second place. For his final year, Lee was given the position of adjutant of the Corps, the highest position a cadet could hold. He took his final exam on June 1, 1828, finishing second once again. Only Charles Mason ranked higher. Graduating second from West Point earned Lee his choice of commission. He selected the Army Corps of Engineers, a position reserved for top students that promised prestige, important work, and steady advancement. But his triumph was immediately overshadowed by tragedy. Lee arrived home to find his mother dying. Within weeks of his return, Anne Hill Carter Lee passed away. The woman he'd cared for, the parent who'd held the family together through poverty and abandonment, was gone. Robert E. Lee, at 21 years old, was now truly alone in the world. Following his mother's death, Lee spent increasing time at Arlington, Virginia, specifically at the estate of George Washington Parke Custis, George Washington's adopted grandson. There he courted Mary Anna Randolph Custis, whom he'd met during his first furlough from West Point. They were an odd match. Lee was never late, obsessively organized, disciplined to the point of rigidity. Mary was almost always late and scatterbrained, leaving chaos in her wake. Yet opposites attracted. After supervised visits and proper courtship, Lee asked Mary's father for permission to marry. On June 30, 1831, they wed at Arlington House. Mary made an unusual decision. She moved into Lee's quarters at Fort Monroe, Virginia, where he'd been assigned. They lived completely on their own, without financial support from her wealthy father. Unusual for a woman of her social standing, their marriage was unconventional in other ways too. Mary had a tendency to boss Lee around the house, something shocking in that era. Yet their bond was strong, and Arlington House became the closest thing to a permanent home Lee had ever known. But home was not where Lee spent most of his time. His assignment to Fort Monroe brought him into the tedious, frustrating world of the Army Corps of Engineers. The Corps built forts, harbors, and infrastructure projects, vital work, but maddeningly slow. Projects lacked sufficient funding. They were located in the worst possible places. Decision-making crawled at bureaucratic speed. Lee learned a valuable lesson. If a situation was hopeless and wouldn't change, remove yourself from it. Fort Monroe at least offered steady work. Lee was assigned to expand and reinforce Fort Monroe and build a new supporting fortification, on an artificial island that would become Fort Wool. The work was technically interesting, but brought Lee no joy. He began doubting his choice to join the military. His personal life, however, was flourishing. On September 16, 1832, Mary gave birth to their first child, George Washington Custis Lee, named after his grandfather. Over the following 9 years, 6 more children would follow. Mary Custis Lee, 1835, William Fitzhugh Lee, 1837, Anne Carter Lee, 1839, Eleanor Agnes Lee, 1841, Robert E. Lee, Jr., 1843, and Mildred Child Lee, 1846. It was during these years that Lee's views on slavery crystallized, or rather, failed to crystallize into anything resembling moral courage. In August 1831, Nat Turner led a slave rebellion in nearby Southampton County, Virginia. Turner, an educated slave and preacher, had convinced fellow slaves that God would deliver them from bondage. An eclipse gave him the sign he'd been waiting for. On August 21st, Turner and his followers killed approximately 60 white people before the rebellion was crushed with extreme violence. The Nat Turner Rebellion shattered the South's comforting myth of happy slaves. It resulted in stricter laws controlling slave movement and literacy, and it forced every white Southerner to confront an uncomfortable question. If slavery was benign, why did slaves revolt? Lee's response was to embrace contradiction. In a letter to Mary, he wrote that slavery was a moral and political evil in any country. He acknowledged it was wrong. But then he added that the blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race. This was the moderate Southern gentleman's view. Slavery is evil, but it's God's will that it exists for now. We shouldn't try to end it ourselves. God will handle it in His own time. It was moral cowardice dressed in religious language. Lee knew slavery was wrong. He just didn't think it was his responsibility to do anything about it. This attitude would follow him throughout his life. Between 1834 and 1837, Lee bounced between assignments. He was transferred to Washington, D.C.'s War Department, where office work proved even more monotonous than fort building. The pay was terrible. Promotion chances were slim. His only joy was the birth of his children and occasional dispatching to interesting projects. One such project came in 1835 when he was sent to survey the border between Ohio and Michigan. The two were locked in a ridiculous dispute called the Toledo War, a conflict over 500 square miles that resulted in exactly one injury: a Michigan deputy stabbed by a boy with a penknife. Lee's survey helped resolve the dispute, with Ohio getting the Toledo Strip and Michigan receiving the Upper Peninsula as compensation. But Lee's most significant challenge came in 1837, when he was sent to St. Louis to solve a crisis that threatened America's westward expansion. St. Louis. Taming the untamable river, the Mississippi. River was trying to kill St. Louis. The Great River was cutting a new channel that would bypass the city's port entirely. If the river succeeded, St. Louis would lose its position as the gateway to the American West. Settlers heading to California and Oregon met in St. Louis before beginning their journeys. If the port failed, westward expansion might grind to a halt. The Corps of Engineers had already tried to fix the problem. They dumped tons of boxed sand around Bloody Island, hoping to push the current back towards St. Louis. The boxes had smashed apart, making the problem worse. They tried using oxen to dredge the sand. That failed too. Lee arrived to find a seemingly impossible situation. The Mississippi was one of the world's most powerful rivers. How do you force nature to obey? Lee thought back to his days at West Point, specifically a French textbook on hydrodynamics. The key insight: you can't overpower a river, but you can redirect it using its own force. He designed a system that would use underwater barriers to channel the current while creating resistance that would prevent the dikes from being destroyed by debris. It was brilliant engineering. It worked. The project took years and was eventually shut down by angry Illinois citizens who feared St. Louis's growth would hurt their own trading interests. But Lee's reputation as a problem solver grew. In July 1838, he was promoted to captain, his first real promotion in over 10 years of service. Yet for all his engineering success, Lee was increasingly frustrated. He'd been in the army for 13 years. He'd built forts, surveyed borders, tamed rivers. He'd proven himself exceptionally competent. And he was still just a captain with a growing family and insufficient pay. What Lee wanted, what he'd always wanted since reading about Napoleon's campaigns at West Point, was the chance to lead men in battle, to test himself against a real enemy, to prove he was more than just an engineer who could calculate water flow and structural loads. That chance came in 1846, when the United States went to war with Mexico, and it would reveal that Robert E. Lee possessed a gift for warfare that few men in American history could match. The war with Mexico had been brewing for a decade. After Texas won independence from Mexico in 1836, tensions simmered over borders, territory, and American expansionism. When the United States annexed Texas in 1845, Mexico severed diplomatic relations. President James Polk sent troops to the disputed border region between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Mexican cavalry attacked, killing 16 Americans. Polk had his justification. American blood has been shed upon American soil, he declared to Congress. War was declared in May 1846. For Robert E. Lee, it was the opportunity he'd been waiting for his entire career. On August 19, 1846, Lee was dispatched to San Antonio, Texas, to report to Brigadier General John E. Wool. Finally, at age 39, after 19 years in the Army, Lee was heading to war. The journey taught him his first battlefield lesson: never trust exaggerated reports. Mexican officers would appear with flags of truce, claiming victories that hadn't happened or defeats that weren't as severe as reported. Lee learned to verify everything, trust nothing, and personally scout enemy positions whenever possible. General Wool recognized Lee's determination and made him acting inspector general. It was an important position, but Lee wanted more. He wanted combat. In January 1847, Lee transferred to General Winfield Scott's command, the same Scott who'd formed a positive opinion of Lee back when they'd both served on the Board of Examiners at West Point. Scott welcomed Lee into his general staff and inner circle, quartering him on the flagship USS Massachusetts. Lee shared a room with his old West Point classmate Joseph E. Johnston. Scott's plan was audacious: land 12,000 men at Veracruz, capture the heavily fortified city, then march 280 miles inland to Mexico City. It would be the largest amphibious operation in American history till World War II. On March 5, 1847, the fleet arrived at Veracruz. Lee saw the imposing fortress of San Juan de Ulua guarding the harbor. He boarded a ship with General Scott to survey landing beaches. They strayed too close to the fortress. Cannons roared. Shot splashed into the water around them. For the first time in his 22-year military career, Robert E. Lee was under fire. The landing on March 9th went unopposed. 2,595 soldiers reached shore without resistance. But taking the city required a siege. On the night of March 22nd, American mortars opened fire. For days, shells pounded Veracruz. Civilians died alongside soldiers. Buildings collapsed. The city burned. Lee watched the devastation with horror. He wrote to Mary, "It was awful. My heart bled for the inhabitants. The soldiers I did not care so much for, but it was terrible to think of the women and children." It was Lee's introduction to war's brutality, a lesson that never seemed to fully sink in. For all his sensitivity to civilian suffering in Mexico, he would later command armies that brought far worse devastation to American cities. Veracruz fell on March 27th. Now came the hard part. marching to Mexico City through hostile territory with stretched supply lines and no reliable intelligence. The Mexican commander, General Antonio López de Santa Anna, the Napoleon of the West, waited at Cerro Gordo with 12,000 troops in an imposing defensive position. Scott had 6,000 men. A frontal assault would be suicide. Lee volunteered to scout a route around Santa Anna's flank. He spent days reconnoitering through rough terrain, at one point hiding behind a log for hours while Mexican soldiers rested mere feet away. He found it, a pathway that could bring American forces to the extreme left flank of Santa Anna's line without being detected. Scott approved the plan and gave Lee the honor of guiding the division personally. On April 17th, soldiers began scaling the hill at night. They made too much noise. The Mexicans heard them and counterattacked down the slope. American forces charged upward, pushing the Mexicans back, finally establishing control of the summit. The next day, the full assault began. Santa Anna's position collapsed. His army fled. American casualties were minimal. Lee's flanking maneuver had won the battle. He was promoted to brevet major and received praise from every senior officer. More importantly, he'd proven to himself that he possessed an instinct for warfare, an ability to see opportunities others missed, and the audacity to exploit them. Scott's army continued toward Mexico City. After smaller engagements, they reached the fortress of Chapultepec in September 1847. The fortress overlooked Mexico City from a rocky hill. Taking it was essential. As senior engineer, Lee argued against direct assault. The position was too strong. There had to be another way. Scott overruled him. The attack would proceed. Lee led General Pillow's division to the fortress's west flank. The first assault was repulsed. The second succeeded. Lee climbed the slope alongside Lieutenants James Longstreet and George Pickett, two men he'd meet again under very different circumstances. During the assault, Lee was wounded but managed to help General Pillow to safety before collapsing from exhaustion. Chapultepec fell. Mexico City surrendered days later. The war was over. Lee was promoted to brevet colonel for his actions at Chapultepec. On June 29, 1848, he returned home to Virginia, having finally experienced war and proven himself exceptional at it. It had taken 32 years from his first day at West Point to reach the rank of brevet colonel, only slightly faster than average for officers of his era. But Lee had gained something more valuable than rank. He'd discovered he possessed a rare gift for battlefield command. General Winfield Scott, America's greatest living soldier, had noticed it too. Scott wrote that Lee was the very best soldier I ever saw in the field. It was the highest praise an American officer could receive, and it would haunt Lee for the rest of his life. Because when the ultimate test came, when Lee had to choose between his oath to the United States and his loyalty to Virginia, that gift for warfare would be turned against the nation he'd served for more than 3 decades. The seeds of that choice had already been planted. They would take 13 more years to bear their terrible fruit. 32 years. That's how long it took Robert E. Lee to rise from West Point cadet to brevet colonel. In comparison to other officers of his era, he'd advanced only marginally faster than average. The brevet promotions, temporary ranks awarded for battlefield gallantry, were nice, but they didn't come with permanent authority or increased pay. Lee returned from Mexico in 1848 as a respected officer, but not a particularly powerful one. The peacetime army had little use for warriors. Engineers and administrators ran the service. Lee went back to what he knew, building forts, managing projects, drowning in paperwork. But his reputation had grown. In 1852, the army offered him something unexpected: superintendent of West Point. It was a major compliment to his abilities and character. Lee accepted, though he complained privately to his friend P.G.T. Beauregard about the impossibility of either giving or receiving satisfaction from the position. He was right to be skeptical. West Point cadets were notorious for their rowdiness, pranks, and undisciplined behavior. Lee couldn't coddle them. Weak leadership would produce weak officers. So he doubled down on discipline, corporal punishment, demerits, and in the worst cases, expulsion. It didn't work. The problems that plagued West Point during his tenure couldn't be fixed by one superintendent in 2.5 years. But Lee did accomplish something significant. He transformed the cavalry school, lobbying for new stables and a practice ring, facilities he may have designed himself, as they bore striking resemblance to the stables at Arlington House. Under Lee's guidance, West Point produced some of the finest cavalry officers of the era. Many of them would later serve under his command. Others would fight against him. In March 1855, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis offered Lee what he'd been wanting since Mexico, a real combat command. Lee was promoted to lieutenant colonel of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. It came at a cost. He had to resign from the Corps of Engineers and leave his family behind to serve in Texas. Lee finally had his combat command, but Texas would bring him no joy. The Texas assignment was supposed to be Lee's breakthrough. Instead, it became a series of losses that left him emotionally devastated. His mother-in-law died, then his sister Mildred. Then in October 1857, his father-in-law, George Washington, Parke Custis, the only real father figure Lee had ever known, died at Arlington. Custis's death forced Lee to return to Virginia to settle the estate. What he found was chaos. Custis had been a kind master, but a terrible administrator. He'd left 196 slaves largely to their own devices in his final years, allowing them to cultivate personal gardens and live with unusual freedom. The estates were in disarray, debts were mounting, and now everything was Lee's responsibility. Custis's will freed his slaves. He'd been a member of the American Colonization Society, which sought to send freed blacks to Liberia. But the will included a provision allowing Lee to retain them until the estate's debts were paid. Lee could have freed them immediately and handled the debt differently. He chose not to. Instead, he invested money upgrading the slave quarters and put them back to work, partly, he claimed, to do what is right and best for the people, but mostly because he needed their labor to make the plantations profitable. This caused immediate unrest. The Arlington slave community had been together since Mount Vernon days. Families had stayed intact, rare in the slave South. They'd enjoyed relative autonomy under Custis. Now Lee was tightening control, and worse, hiring some of them out to other plantations without explaining how long they'd be gone. The slaves began testing Lee's authority. Some asserted they were legally free under Custis's will, which wasn't entirely wrong, though the courts wouldn't have sided with them. In late spring 1859, 3 slaves ran, Wesley Norris, his sister Mary, and their cousin George Parks. They were caught and brought back. What happened next became a scandal in abolitionist newspapers. Wesley Norris later claimed that Lee personally ordered them whipped, 50 lashes for the men, 20 for Mary, and that Lee himself wielded the whip when the overseer refused to continue. Norris said Lee then had brine poured into their wounds to increase the pain. Lee and other witnesses disputed the exact details, but they confirmed the general account. Whipping certainly occurred. Whether Lee personally administered it or merely ordered it is unclear. A man of Lee's social standing wouldn't typically deliver punishment himself. It would have been seen as beneath him, but he clearly authorized it. The incident reveals an uncomfortable truth. For all Lee's private statements about slavery, being evil, he had no qualms about using violence to maintain control over human beings he claimed to own. The man who'd written that slavery was a moral and political evil was now whipping slaves who dared believe they deserved freedom. The contradiction was laid bare. Lee knew slavery was wrong. He just valued property rights and social order more than he valued human freedom. On October 17, 1859, J.E.B. Jebb, Stuart rode to Arlington and requested Lee come to the War Department immediately. Lee entered a meeting with President James Buchanan and several cabinet members. An abolitionist named John Brown had seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with 18 armed followers. They'd killed civilians and taken hostages. The local militia had surrounded Brown's forces in the arsenal's engine house, but the situation was at a stalemate. Lee and Stuart were dispatched via special train with a company of Marines. When they arrived, Lee gave Brown a chance to surrender. Brown refused. Lee ordered the Marines to storm the engine house. The assault lasted minutes. 1 Marine died. 2 of Brown's men died. Brown himself was wounded and captured. Lee dismissed the raid as the attempt of a fanatic or a madman that could only end in failure. He was spectacularly wrong about its significance. Among those who watched John Brown's execution on December 2nd, 1859, were several men whose names would soon be famous: Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Edmund Ruffin, and a young actor named John Wilkes Booth. Brown's raid had lit a fuse. The explosion was coming. In February 1860, Lee returned to Texas. Across the South, talk of secession was intensifying. Southern politicians were openly discussing leaving the Union if Abraham Lincoln won the presidency. Lee was appalled. He saw secession as anarchy, as the destruction of everything the founders had built. In letters to family, he made his position clear. The Union was sacred. Secession was treason, but he also made something else clear. If Virginia chose to leave, he would go with her. This was the American dilemma in 1860-61. Loyalty to state came before loyalty to nation. Men felt their first duty was to their home, their neighbors, their birthplace, not to some distant government in Washington. Lee swore he would never take arms against the United States, but if Virginia seceded, he would give his life to defend her. It was a contradiction he couldn't reconcile, so he didn't try. He simply waited for Virginia to decide his fate. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in November 1860. South Carolina seceded in December. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed in January and February 1861. Virginia, however, held back. A state convention would decide, but no decision was imminent. On March 13, 1861, Lee attended a reception for military officers at the White House. He met President Lincoln for the first and only time. Lincoln knew Lee's allegiance was uncertain. He offered Lee command of the 1st Regiment of Cavalry, a promotion Lee couldn't afford to refuse. But peace was already dying. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces under General P.G.T. Beauregard, Lee's old friend and colleague, opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Edmund Ruffin, the radical secessionist who'd watched John Brown hang, fired some of the first shots. Fort Sumter fell on April 14. Virginia's convention immediately called for a secession vote. General Winfield Scott, Lee's commander from Mexico, the man who'd called him the finest soldier he'd ever seen, summoned Lee to Washington. Scott begged him to stay with the Union. Lincoln was prepared to offer Lee command of the entire Union Army. Lee listened. Then he went home to Arlington to make his choice. For 2 days and nights he wrestled with his decision. He paced his bedroom floor. He read scripture. He prayed for guidance. His wife Mary watched him. She knew the agony he felt. This wasn't a simple choice. This was choosing between everything he'd built in 32 years of service and the land where he was born. Lee had sworn an oath to the United States. He'd built his entire identity around duty, honor, and obligation to the Constitution. Breaking that oath would violate everything he'd taught cadets at West Point, everything he believed about military honor. But Virginia was his home. His ancestors had helped build America. His father had fought for American independence. Washington himself was Lee's wife's great-grandfather. How could he raise his hand against Virginia? On April 20, 1861, Robert E. Lee signed his resignation from the United States Army. He wrote to his sister, With all my devotion to the Union and the feeling of loyalty and duty of an American citizen, I have not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home, and to a Northern friend, if Virginia stands by the old Union, so will I. But if she secedes, though I do not believe in secession as a constitutional right, nor that there is sufficient cause for revolution, then I will follow my native state with my sword, and if need be, with my life. The decision was made. Lee boarded a train to Richmond to assess the situation. He expected to remain a private citizen. He had no desire for command in a rebellion he'd opposed, but when he arrived in Richmond, he learned he was to be offered command of all Confederate military forces in Virginia. Virginia officially seceded on May 23, 1861, federal. Troops immediately crossed the Potomac and occupied northern Virginia, including Arlington House. Mary barely escaped with the family's possessions. Federal authorities would later seize Arlington permanently, and Quartermaster General Montgomery, Meigs, who despised Lee as a traitor, ordered that Union dead from the First Battle of Bull Run be buried in a circle around the house. Itself, titled Lee's beloved Arlington, would become Arlington National Cemetery. He would never set foot in his home again. The choice was made. There was no going back. And now Robert E. Lee would have to live with the consequences. Lee's entry into Confederate service was frustrating. He was appointed commander of Virginia's forces, but Virginia soon transferred its military to the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis, Lee's old troublemaking friend from West Point, was now president of the Confederate States. Davis appointed Lee as his military advisor, but didn't give him field command. Lee watched from Richmond. As the First Battle of Bull Run was fought on July 21, 1861, Confederate forces under Beauregard and Joseph Johnston routed the Union Army. It was a shocking Confederate victory that convinced many Southerners the war would be short. Lee hadn't participated. He was stuck in an office while others won glory. Davis finally gave him a chance in the fall of 1861 drive Union forces from Western Virginia. Lee marched into the mountains with an elaborate plan to trap the enemy at Cheat Mountain. The plan fell apart due to poor coordination and bad weather. Lee retreated humiliated. The Richmond newspapers that had praised him after Mexico now mocked him. Granny Lee, they called him. Too cautious, too careful, not aggressive enough. Lee was then sent to organize coastal defenses in South Carolina and Georgia. Important work, but far from the main action in Virginia. While he built fortifications, the war's major battles happened without him. Then, on May 31st, 1862, everything changed. General Joseph E. Johnston, Lee's old friend from West Point, his roommate aboard the USS Massachusetts during the Mexican War, was wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines outside Richmond. Davis needed someone to take command of the Army of Northern Virginia immediately. He chose Robert E. Lee. Lee was 55 years old. He'd spent 36 years in military service, and for the first time, he commanded an army in combat. He was about to prove that Winfield Scott had been right about him all along. When Lee took command on June 1st, 1862, the Union Army under General George McClellan was threatening Richmond itself. McClellan had 105,000 men. Lee had roughly 70,000. Confederate government officials were packing to flee the capital. Lee studied McClellan. He knew him from Mexico. McClellan had been there as a young lieutenant. Lee understood McClellan's weakness. He was cautious, overly careful, always convinced the enemy outnumbered him. Lee decided to attack. It was a characteristic decision. For all the criticism that he was too cautious, Lee's instinct was always aggression. He'd learned from Napoleon, seize the initiative, keep the enemy off balance, attack before they expect it. On June 26th, Lee ordered General A.P. Hill to strike McClellan's right flank at Mechanicsville. It was the beginning of what became known as the 7 Days Battles, a week of nearly continuous combat that would define Lee's command style. The fighting was brutal. At Gaines' Mill, 8,000 men fell in a single afternoon. At Savage's Station, Lee attacked McClellan's retreating forces. At Fraser's Farm and Malvern Hill, the battles continued with mounting casualties. Tactically, Lee made mistakes. The coordination between his divisions was poor. Attacks were sometimes uncoordinated and frontal assaults cost lives unnecessarily. But strategically, Lee succeeded brilliantly. McClellan retreated away from Richmond. The Confederate capital was saved. Lincoln was furious at McClellan's failure and replaced him with General John Pope. Lee had won his first campaign, and he'd established a pattern that would define the next 2 years: aggressive attacks, acceptance of high casualties, and a willingness to take risks that made his subordinates nervous. The newspapers that had mocked Granny Lee now praised him. He was the South's savior. But the 7 days had cost the Confederacy 20,000 casualties, men the South couldn't easily replace. For every tactical victory, Lee was bleeding his army. It was a pattern that would eventually destroy him. In August 1862, Lee learned that Pope would receive massive reinforcements from McClellan's army. If those forces united, Lee would face overwhelming numbers. He had to strike before they combined. Lee called for Thomas Stonewall Jackson to join him. Jackson had earned his nickname at First Bull Run by standing like a stone wall against Union assaults. He was a strange, deeply religious man who sucked lemons constantly, slept sitting up because he believed his organs worked better that way, and was possibly the most aggressive combat general in either army. Lee and Jackson together were formidable. Lee provided the strategic vision. Jackson provided the relentless execution. Lee sent Jackson on a sweeping flanking march around Pope's army. Jackson's men covered 50 miles in 2 days, an exhausting march that left them hungry and footsore but perfectly positioned behind Pope's supply lines. Jackson attacked the Union supply depot at Manassas Junction, capturing desperately needed food, equipment, and ammunition. Pope turned his entire army around to chase Jackson. This was exactly what Lee wanted. While Pope focused on Jackson, Lee's main force under General James Longstreet marched to join them. On August 29, 1862, the Second Battle of Bull Run was fought on the same ground as the first. Jackson's men held a defensive position, absorbing repeated Union assaults. Then Longstreet's corps arrived and smashed into Pope's exposed flank. The Union army broke and fled back to Washington in disarray. Lee had won another stunning victory, and he'd done it with the same formula: divide his forces, move quickly, strike the enemy where they least expected it, and rely on aggressive subordinates to execute the plan. Pope was relieved of command. Lincoln, desperate, reinstated McClellan. Lee had now cleared Virginia of Union forces. The South was jubilant. Some European nations were considering recognizing the Confederacy. Lee made a decision that would change everything. He would invade the North. Lee's reasons for invading Maryland were both military and political. Militarily, he wanted to shift the war out of ravaged Virginia and threaten Washington from a new direction. Politically, he hoped a victory on Northern soil would convince Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy and perhaps broker a peace. It was a calculated risk. His army was exhausted from continuous campaigning. Many men were barefoot. Supplies were limited. But Lee believed momentum and morale could overcome material disadvantages. He divided his army, a risky move that had worked at Second Bull Run. He sent Jackson to capture the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry while the rest of the army moved north into Maryland, but McClellan got lucky. A Union soldier found a copy of Lee's orders wrapped around cigars at an abandoned Confederate campsite. McClellan now knew Lee's army was divided and where each piece was located. For once, McClellan moved with speed. He pushed Lee's forces back from South Mountain and caught up with Lee's army near the town of Sharpsburg, along Antietam Creek. Lee made a decision that every military analyst since has questioned. He chose to stand and fight at Sharpsburg, even though his army was still divided and Jackson hadn't yet returned from Harper's Ferry. Worse, the ground itself was a trap, Antietam Creek was on one side, the Potomac River on two others. Lee had only one viable retreat route. If McClellan broke his line, the entire Confederate army could be destroyed. But Lee believed McClellan wouldn't press his advantage, and he was right. On September 17, 1862, the Battle of Antietam became the bloodiest single day in American history. The fighting started at dawn. Union forces attacked Lee's left flank near a Dunker church. The cornfield between the two armies changed hands 15 times. Men fell in rows like wheat before a scythe. Then the battle shifted to the center, where Confederate forces held a sunken road that became known as Bloody Lane. For hours, Union forces hammered the position. When Confederate troops finally broke and ran, they left hundreds of bodies stacked in the lane. But McClellan didn't exploit the breakthrough. His reserves sat unused. The final attack came at Burnside's Bridge, where Union General Ambrose Burnside spent hours trying to cross a narrow stone bridge under fire instead of simply wading across the shallow creek. When his men finally broke through, A.P. Hill's division, which had force-marched from Harper's Ferry, arrived just in time to smash Burnside's assault and save Lee's right flank. By nightfall, 2,700 men were casualties. Lee's army had survived, but barely. McClellan had missed his chance to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee retreated back to Virginia with his army intact, but bloodied. The battle was tactically a draw. Both sides held the field and claimed victory. But strategically it was a Union victory. Lee's invasion had failed. His hopes for European recognition collapsed. And on September 22, 1862, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in Confederate states to be free. The war had just changed. It was no longer about states' rights or constitutional interpretation. It was now explicitly about slavery. Lee had fought to preserve Virginia, but he was now fighting to preserve an institution he'd once called evil. After Antietam, McClellan's failure to pursue Lee led Lincoln to fire him yet again. His replacement was Ambrose Burnside, the same general who'd wasted hours at Antietam trying to cross a bridge he could have waded through. Burnside's plan was straightforward: march to Fredericksburg, cross the Rappahannock River, and advance on Richmond. Simple, direct, terrible. Lee saw Burnside's army coming and positioned his forces on high ground behind Fredericksburg. Longstreet's corps held Mary's Heights, a ridge behind a stone wall. Jackson's corps held the right flank. Lee had 72,000 men in nearly perfect defensive positions. Burnside had 120,000 men. His plan was to smash through Lee's line by sheer force of numbers. On December 11, 1862, Union engineers began building pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock. Confederate sharpshooters in Fredericksburg made it nearly impossible. Burnside ordered artillery to bombard the town, the first time in the war that American forces deliberately shelled an American city. The town was devastated, but the snipers remained. When Union forces finally crossed and occupied Fredericksburg, they sacked the city, looting homes despite officers' orders to stop. On December 13th, Burnside launched his assault. It was a slaughter. Wave after wave of Union soldiers advanced across open ground toward Mary's Heights. Confederate infantry behind the stone wall fired at point-blank range. Artillery tore holes in the advancing lines. Men fell by the hundreds, by the thousands. Lee watched from his position on the ridge. At one point, as another doomed Union assault began, he turned to Longstreet and said, "It is well that war is so terrible, or we should grow too fond of it." The line has become famous, Lee's recognition of war's seductive horror. But it didn't stop him from ordering attacks that would kill thousands of his own men in battles to come. By the end of the day, Burnside had lost 12,600 men. Lee lost 5,300, the Union Army retreated back across the river. Fredericksburg was a complete Confederate victory, but it meant nothing strategically. Richmond remained threatened. The Union Army remained massive and growing. The Confederacy's manpower was steadily depleting. Lee had won the battle, but he was losing the war, one irreplaceable casualty at a time. Burnside was replaced by General Joseph Fighting Joe Hooker. And in the spring of 1863, Lee would face Hooker in a battle that would showcase both his greatest brilliance and his greatest loss. In May 1863, General Joseph Hooker commanded 134,000 men, nearly double Lee's force of 60,000. Hooker was confident, even cocky. He told his officers, "May God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none." Hooker's plan was sophisticated. He divided his army into multiple columns, sending cavalry to raid toward Richmond, while his main force would cross the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers through a dense forest called the Wilderness. He would attack Lee from both front and rear simultaneously, crushing the Confederate army in a massive double envelopment. On paper, it was brilliant. In execution, it fell apart. Lee recognized the danger immediately. He made a decision that shocked his subordinates. He would divide his already outnumbered force. He sent General Jubal Early with 10,000 men to hold Fredericksburg against General Sedgwick, while Lee took 50,000 to face Hooker. Hooker had Lee exactly where he wanted him, caught between two. Union forces outnumbered at both positions. But when Lee's advance units made contact, Hooker's confidence evaporated. Instead of pressing his overwhelming advantage, he pulled his forces back to Chancellorsville into a defensive position. His officers were stunned. They'd advanced into tactically superior ground. Now Hooker was giving it up and withdrawing into the Wilderness where his numerical advantage meant nothing. On the night of May 1st, Lee met with Stonewall Jackson to discuss their options. They were outnumbered more than 2-1. Any conventional attack would fail. They needed something audacious. Jackson proposed a flanking march around Hooker's entire right flank, a 16-mile march through the Wilderness with 28,000 men. It would take all day. It would leave Lee with barely 14,000 men holding the center. If Hooker discovered the maneuver and attacked, Lee's army would be destroyed. Lee approved it immediately. On May 2nd, Jackson began his march. His men moved in a long column through the woods, mostly hidden from Union observation. Some Union officers spotted the movement and reported it to Hooker, but Hooker dismissed it as a Confederate retreat. By late afternoon, Jackson had positioned his entire corps perpendicular to the Union right flank, held by General Oliver Howard's Eighth Corps. The Union soldiers were relaxing, cooking dinner, playing cards. They had no idea 28,000 Confederate soldiers were hidden in the woods barely 200 yards away. At 5 p.m., Jackson gave the order, "You may go forward." What followed was one of the most devastating surprise attacks in military history. Confederate soldiers burst from the woods with a rebel yell echoing through the forest. Wild animals, deer, rabbits, foxes, fled ahead of them as if escaping a forest fire. The Union Int Corps disintegrated in panic. Men threw down their weapons and ran. Officers tried to form defensive lines, but the assault was overwhelming. Jackson's men rolled up the Union flank for 2 miles before darkness and exhaustion finally slowed the attack. Pockets of Union resistance formed. The assault ground to a halt, but the damage was done. Hooker's army was bent into a horseshoe defensive position around Chancellorsville. His grand offensive had become a desperate defense. After dark, Jackson rode forward with a few officers to scout the new Union positions. They encountered a Union picket and rode quickly back toward their own lines. Confederate soldiers, tense and trigger-happy after hours of combat, heard horses approaching in the darkness. They assumed it was Union cavalry. They opened fire. Jackson was hit 3 times, once in the right hand, twice in the left arm. His officers dragged him to safety. Field surgeons amputated his shattered left arm. When Lee learned of Jackson's wounding, he was devastated. "He has lost his left arm," Lee said, "but I have lost my right arm." Command of Jackson's corps fell to A.P. Hill, but Hill was almost immediately wounded as well. J.E.B. Stuart, a cavalry commander who'd never led infantry, took over by default. On May 3rd, Lee and Stuart attacked Hooker's position from both sides. During the fighting, a cannonball struck the Chancellor House where Hooker was standing. The concussion knocked him unconscious. Semi-conscious and possibly concussed, Hooker ordered a retreat. By May 6th, the Union Army had withdrawn back across the Rappahannock. Lee had won perhaps the most brilliant tactical victory of the war. Outnumbered 2-1, he divided his forces twice and defeated an army that should have crushed him. But the victory came at terrible cost. The Confederacy suffered 13,000 casualties it couldn't replace, and on May 10, 1863, 8 days after being shot by his own men, Stonewall Jackson died of pneumonia. Lee attended the funeral in Richmond. He rarely showed emotion, but those who knew him could see his grief. Jackson had been more than his most talented subordinate. He'd been the general who understood Lee's intentions without lengthy explanations, who executed bold plans without hesitation, who shared Lee's aggressive instincts. Lee would never find another Jackson, and 3 months later, the absence of Jackson's instinctive aggression would contribute to Lee's greatest mistake. After Chancellorsville, Lee decided to invade the North again. His reasoning was sound. Virginia's farms were exhausted from supporting his army. A summer campaign in Pennsylvania would allow his men to feed themselves from northern resources. It might also relieve pressure on Vicksburg, where Grant was besieging the critical Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi. And a victory on northern soil might still convince Britain or France to recognize the Confederacy. But Lee was working without Jackson. He reorganized his army from 2 corps into 3, promoting Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill to command alongside James Longstreet. Ewell was competent but indecisive. Hill was aggressive to the point of recklessness. Longstreet was experienced but preferred defensive tactics, the opposite of Lee's instincts. Lee also lacked J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry for reconnaissance. Stuart had taken his horsemen on a raid around the Union Army, trying to redeem himself after embarrassment at the Battle of Brandy Station. Instead of providing intelligence about enemy positions, Stuart left Lee blind, guessing at where the Union Army was located. On July 1, 1863, Confederate forces stumbled into Union cavalry near the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. Neither side had planned to fight there. It just happened. The first day went well for the Confederates. Union cavalry under General John Buford held McPherson's Ridge until Union infantry arrived. General John Reynolds, one of the Union's best corps commanders, was killed almost immediately. By early afternoon, Confederate forces had pushed the Union Army through Gettysburg in chaotic retreat. The Union forces rallied on high ground south of town, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge. It was strong defensive terrain. Lee arrived and assessed the situation. He gave General Ewell an order that would haunt Confederate historians forever: take Cemetery Hill if practicable. Ewell, indecisive and new to corps command, looked at the Union position. His men were exhausted. He wasn't sure he could take the hill, so he decided to rest them instead. By the time Lee realized Ewell wasn't attacking, the opportunity was gone. Union reinforcements were streaming onto the high ground. What had been a vulnerable position was now a fortress. That night, Longstreet begged Lee to reconsider his strategy. "We could move south," Longstreet argued, "position ourselves between Meade and Washington, and force him to attack us on ground of our choosing." It was sound advice. Lee had succeeded throughout the war by forcing enemies to attack him or by flanking them. A defensive position with 70,000 men could have devastated the Union Army. Lee refused. He was determined to destroy Meade's army here and now. he would attack. On July 2nd, Lee focused his assaults on both ends of the Union line. The fighting was savage. At Little Round Top, the 20th Maine under Colonel Joshua Chamberlain held the crucial high ground in desperate fighting that came down to a bayonet charge. At the wheat field, the peach orchard, and Devil's Den, thousands fell in confused, brutal combat. Ewell attacked Cemetery Hill in the evening, but was driven back. The Union line bent, but didn't break. On the morning of July 3rd, Lee made his most controversial decision. He was convinced the Union center was weak, that Meade had reinforced his flanks at the expense of his middle. He decided to assault the center with a massive infantry charge. He was wrong. Meade had reinforced the center, guessing correctly where Lee would attack. Lee assigned the assault to General George Pickett's fresh division, supported by other units. In total, about 2,500 men would advance across nearly a mile of open ground, exposed to Union artillery and rifle fire, to attack a heavily defended position on Cemetery Ridge. Longstreet thought it was suicide. When Lee gave the order, Longstreet later claimed he couldn't bring himself to speak and simply nodded. The attack began with an artillery barrage, over 150 Confederate guns firing at the Union center, trying to soften the defenses. Union artillery initially remained silent. Lee's officers thought they'd destroyed the Union guns. They hadn't. The Union had simply held fire to conserve ammunition. At 3 p.m., Pickett's division emerged from the woods and began their advance. They marched in perfect formation, flags flying as if on parade. Union artillery opened fire. Solid shot tore holes in the Confederate lines. Men fell by the dozens. The survivors closed ranks and kept walking. As they crossed the halfway point, Union infantry opened fire. Entire regiments disappeared under the fusillade. The Confederate line wavered but pushed forward. A few hundred men, perhaps 200, actually reached the stone wall at the center of the Union line in what became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. They fought hand to hand for a few desperate minutes before being killed or captured. The rest of Pickett's division streamed back toward Confederate lines, broken and bleeding. Of the 2,500 men who made the charge, nearly 6,500 were casualties. Lee rode out to meet the survivors. "It's all my fault," he told them. "It is I who have lost this fight." For once, Lee was taking full responsibility. Pickett's charge was his decision, his mistake. His defeat on July 4th, Lee's army began retreating to Virginia. He'd lost over a third of his army, 28,000 casualties in 3 days. The Army of Northern Virginia would never fully recover. Gettysburg was the turning point of the war. Lee had taken his best army into the north and been decisively defeated. On the same day Gettysburg ended, Vicksburg fell to Grant, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River. The Confederacy could no longer win the war. It could only delay the inevitable. Lee would not engage in another major offensive battle. The final 2 years of the war became a grim war of attrition as the Union slowly ground down Confederate resources. In May 1864, Ulysses S. Grant, the general who'd taken Vicksburg, took command of all Union armies. Grant's strategy was simple and brutal. Attack Lee constantly, accept heavy casualties, and use the Union's superior numbers to wear down the Confederacy. The two armies collided in the wilderness in early May 1864. The battle was inconclusive, but horrifically bloody. Unlike previous Union commanders, Grant didn't retreat after failing to defeat Lee. Instead, he moved south and attacked again at Spotsylvania Courthouse. The pattern continued through the summer. Grant attacked, Lee defended, both sides bled, and Grant moved south again. At Cold Harbor in June, Grant ordered a frontal assault that cost 7,000 Union casualties in less than an hour, a disaster even Grant later regretted. But Grant kept coming. By June 1864, Grant had Lee trapped at Petersburg, beginning a siege that would last 9 months. Lee's army slowly starved. Desertion rates climbed, supplies dwindled. The Confederacy was dying. On April 2nd, 1865, Grant finally broke through Petersburg's defenses. Lee evacuated his army and abandoned Richmond. The Confederate capital fell the next day. For a week, Lee's army fled west with Grant's forces in pursuit. Union cavalry under General Philip Sheridan and Division Commander George Custer cut off escape routes and attacked supply wagons relentlessly. By April 9, 1865, Lee's army was trapped at Appomattox Courthouse. He had perhaps 28,000 men left, most of them starving and exhausted. Grant had over $100,000. Lee met with his officers. "There is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant," he said, "and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." But he wouldn't ask his men to die in a hopeless cause. The war was over. Lee dressed carefully for the surrender meeting. He wore his finest uniform, gray with a red silk sash and his ceremonial sword. If he was going to surrender, he would do it with dignity. Grant arrived at Wilmer McLean's house in Appomattox Courthouse, wearing a mud-splattered private's uniform with his lieutenant general's stars pinned to the shoulders. The contrast was striking. Lee immaculate and formal, Grant disheveled and practical. The two men talked briefly about their service together in Mexico before getting to business. Grant's terms were extraordinarily generous. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms and personal horses. All soldiers would be paroled and allowed to return home as long as they didn't take up arms against the United States again. Officers and men wouldn't be prosecuted for treason. Lee asked one more favor. Many of his men owned their horses personally. Could they keep them? They'd need them for spring plowing. Grant agreed immediately. When Lee left the McLean house, his army began cheering. Lee raised his hand for silence. "Men," he said, "we have fought through the war together. I have done the best I could for you. My heart is too full to say more." The Army of Northern Virginia formally surrendered on April 12, 1865. Confederate soldiers stacked their weapons and furled their battle flags. Many were weeping. The Civil War officially ended on May 13, 1865. In 4 years, approximately 750,000 Americans had died, more than all other American wars combined until Vietnam. And Robert E. Lee, the Confederacy's greatest general, had to figure out how to live in the nation he'd tried to destroy. Lee could have been prosecuted for treason. Many in the North demanded it. But Grant insisted that the surrender terms be honored. Lee would not be arrested. He lost his citizenship and his right to vote. Arlington was gone, transformed into a cemetery for Union dead. His family was scattered. His fortune was gone. He was 58 years old in failing health and facing an uncertain future. In September 1865, Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, offered Lee its presidency. The college was nearly bankrupt, its buildings damaged, its enrollment decimated. Lee accepted. He spent his final 5 years trying to rebuild, not just the college, but the South itself. He encouraged young men to move forward, to accept the war's outcome, to build rather than brood. When former Confederates like Jefferson Davis and Jubal Early continued fighting the war with angry words, Lee rebuked them. Most significantly, Lee opposed the construction of Confederate monuments and memorials. In an 1869 letter, he wrote that such monuments would keep open the sores of war and prevent the nation from healing. He believed the South needed to accept its defeat and move forward. It was perhaps his wisest counsel. It was also largely ignored. Lee also expressed support, however limited, for gradual political rights for freed slaves, writing that everyone should do all in his power to aid in the restoration of peace and harmony. But he never advocated for full equality, and his views on race remained paternalistic at best. On September 28, 1870, Lee attended a church meeting. When he returned home for supper, his wife Mary poured him tea. As Lee stood to say grace, no words came out. He'd suffered a stroke. For 2 weeks, Lee lingered. His family gathered around him. On October 12, 1870, at 9:30 in the morning, Robert Edward Lee died. His last reported words, spoken in delirium, were, Strike the tent. He was buried in Lexington, Virginia. Thousands attended his funeral. The South mourned him as a hero. The North acknowledged him as a worthy adversary, and America began the long, complicated process of deciding what Robert E. Lee's life actually meant. Robert E. Lee has been called a Caesar without his ambition, a Frederick without his tyranny, a Napoleon without his selfishness, and a Washington without his reward. It's a generous assessment. Too generous. Lee was undeniably brilliant as a military commander. His victories at Second Manassas and Chancellorsville rank among the greatest in military history. His ability to read enemy commanders, anticipate their moves, and exploit their weaknesses was extraordinary. Against all odds, with inferior numbers and resources, he held off the Union Army for 3 years. But brilliance in war doesn't make a man great. Greatness requires something more: moral courage, far-sightedness, and actions that benefit humanity. Lee failed that test. He knew slavery was evil. He said so explicitly in letters. Yet when given the chance to act on that conviction, when he inherited nearly 200 slaves, he chose profit over principle. When those slaves sought freedom, he had them whipped. When the nation faced its greatest crisis, he chose the slave-holding South over the Union. Lee's defenders argue he fought for Virginia, not slavery. There's truth to that. His choice was driven by loyalty to his home state. But Virginia seceded explicitly to preserve slavery. Lee knew this. He chose to lead an army defending that cause. After the war, Lee did counsel reconciliation. He did oppose Confederate monuments. He did work to rebuild rather than perpetuate bitterness. That counts for something, but he never fully confronted what he'd done. He never acknowledged that the cause he'd fought for, however much he framed it as defending Virginia, was fundamentally about preserving human bondage. He never grappled publicly with the moral weight of leading an army that sought to destroy the nation his own father had helped create. Historian Elizabeth Brown Pryor perhaps said it best. We want him to be great because he has elements of greatness in him. He was brilliant, disciplined, dutiful, and personally honorable. But true greatness, Pryor argues, must rest on 2 pillars: creating something that endures and benefits the world, and demonstrating far-sightedness that reaches beyond one's narrow experience. Lee created nothing enduring except memory. He led an army that killed hundreds of thousands in service of a morally bankrupt cause. His far-sightedness extended only as far as loyalty to Virginia. He couldn't see, or wouldn't see, beyond the comfortable prejudices of his class and region. Would Lee be remembered differently if he'd chosen the Union? Almost certainly. If he'd commanded Union armies, he'd be celebrated unambiguously as one of America's greatest generals. His tactical brilliance would be praised without the complicated moral shadow of having fought for the Confederacy. But he didn't choose the Union. He chose Virginia. And that choice defines his legacy. Robert E. Lee was a supremely gifted military commander who used his gifts in service of the wrong cause. He was a man of personal honor who defended a system of inhuman dishonor. He was capable of greatness but chose duty to state over duty to moral principle. He was, in the end, a man of his time and place, which meant he couldn't rise above the prejudices that shaped him. He saw far enough to know slavery was wrong, but not far enough to refuse to fight for it. That is Robert E. Lee's tragedy, and America's. He was given every advantage: intelligence, education, opportunity, and genius for command. He could have changed history for the better. Instead, he nearly destroyed the nation and killed hundreds of thousands trying to preserve a system he admitted was evil. He lived his final years quietly, teaching young men, encouraging reconciliation, trying to heal wounds. It wasn't enough to redeem his choices during the war, but it was something. In the end, Robert E. Lee is exactly what he said about war itself, a terrible thing that reveals both the best and worst of humanity. His brilliance and his moral failure are inseparable. His genius and his tragedy are intertwined. And, 150 years later, America is still wrestling with what his life means, what his choices say about duty and conscience, about loyalty and morality, about the cost of choosing wrong even when you know better. Perhaps that wrestling is his real legacy, forcing each generation to confront the uncomfortable question, when duty and conscience collide, which do you choose? Robert E. Lee chose duty, and 750,000 Americans paid the price.